So let's start. Imagine the sun, the most constant thing in your entire world, suddenly begins to disappear. No warning. No explanation. Just darkness swallowing the sky in the middle of the day. For ancient civilizations, this wasn't astronomy. This was the end of everything they knew. Number 10. For nearly every ancient culture on Earth, the sun was not a ball of burning gas 93 million miles away. It was a god. A living, breathing deity whose presence guaranteed life, harvest, warmth, and the basic continuation of reality itself. So when that god began to vanish, in the middle of the afternoon, with no clouds, no storm, no reason, the psychological terror it produced was unlike anything we can easily imagine today. In ancient Mesopotamia, the Sumerians and Babylonians watched eclipses with a specific kind of dread. Not general fear, targeted, ritualized, institutionalized fear. They believed that an eclipse was a direct attack on the king, a cosmic assassination attempt. The sun being consumed meant the ruler's divine protection was being stripped away, and if nothing was done, the king would die within 100 days. This wasn't a metaphor. This was policy. So what did the Babylonians actually do? They replaced the king. Temporarily. They would find a substitute king, usually a prisoner, a slave, or a mentally ill person, dress him in royal robes, seat him on the throne, and make him rule. Why? Because if the cosmic omen was targeting the king, the substitute would absorb the curse instead. The real king would hide, live as a commoner, and wait for the eclipse period to pass. Then, once the danger was considered over, the substitute king was quietly removed, executed. The curse needed somewhere to go, and that man absorbed it so the actual ruler could survive. Think about what this tells us. These weren't primitive people acting out of pure superstition. These were sophisticated administrators, mathematicians, astronomers, people who built cities, developed written language, and tracked celestial cycles with impressive precision. And yet, an eclipse was so terrifying, so fundamentally threatening to their entire cosmological worldview, that they rewrote their government in response to one. In ancient China, the belief was different but equally dramatic. The sun was being devoured by a celestial dragon. The dragon was eating the sun. And the only way to stop it was noise, enormous, coordinated, communal noise. Drums, pots, gongs, fireworks in later centuries. The entire population would erupt into cacophony, banging anything they could find, screaming, shouting, making as much sound as possible. And every single time, the dragon retreated. The sun came back. Proof, as far as anyone watching was concerned, that the ritual worked. That the noise drove the monster away. The fact that this would happen regardless of whether anyone banged a drum was not a conclusion available to people who had no model for what an eclipse actually was. This is where ancient fear becomes genuinely fascinating. Because it wasn't irrational given what they knew. Given their cosmological models, given everything they had been taught, everything their parents and priests and traditions told them, the fear was the only logical response. The sun dying was not supposed to happen. And yet it was happening. Right now. What would you do? Number 9. Here is something that very few people know. Eclipses didn't just terrify civilians. They stopped wars. On the battlefield. Mid-fight. One of the most documented cases comes from the ancient Greek world, around 585 BC, in a conflict between the Lydians and the Medes, two powerful empires that had been locked in a bloody war for 5 years. They were in the middle of a battle. Soldiers were fighting, dying, blades in the air. And then the sky went dark. A total solar eclipse rolled across the battlefield in what would later be called the Battle of the Halles, sometimes referred to as the Eclipse of Thales. The fighting stopped. Completely. Both armies, independently, on their own initiative, put down their weapons. The darkness was interpreted as a divine signal, the gods themselves demanding a ceasefire. The war ended that same day. A peace treaty was signed. Two empires that had been slaughtering each other for half a decade stopped because the sun disappeared for a few minutes. Now think about that for a moment. Two armies with completely different cultures, different gods, different languages, and both came to the exact same conclusion simultaneously. This darkness means stop. That tells you something profound about the universality of eclipse fear. It transcended language, transcended cultural specifics, and hit something deeper. Something hardwired into the human perception of the world. The sun going dark is wrong. Fundamentally, viscerally wrong. And when it happens in the middle of a battle, it feels like a verdict. There are other examples. In ancient Aztec culture, eclipses were so feared during certain astronomical windows that wars, which were themselves often ritually scheduled around celestial events, would be postponed entirely. The military calendar and the astronomical calendar were the same document. If the omens were bad, you didn't march. And eclipses were among the worst omens possible. They meant that the sun god tonality was weakening, that the cosmic bargain holding reality together was fraying at the edges. The Aztecs, by the way, had an extraordinarily dark cosmological framework for this. They believed the sun required constant nourishment, specifically human blood, to continue rising each morning. Eclipses were evidence that the nourishment was insufficient, that the sun was hungry. This belief directly fueled the massive ritual sacrifice programs of the Aztec Empire, not as cruelty for cruelty's sake, but as a genuine, terrifying act of cosmic maintenance. Every sacrifice was an attempt to keep the lights on. Literally. So when an eclipse happened, when the sun went dark despite all the offerings, the fear was compounded by guilt. What did we do wrong? How many more sacrifices will it take? It wasn't just fear of the dark. It was fear of having failed the universe itself. That is a psychologically distinct and much heavier kind of terror. And it stopped armies cold. Number 8. Here is a power dynamic that ancient priests understood and exploited with extraordinary effectiveness. They could predict eclipses. And that made them essentially superhuman in the eyes of everyone around them. The Babylonians, those same meticulous astronomers who invented the substitute king ritual, had by around 700 BC developed a mathematical cycle called the Saros cycle. It's an 18-year, 11-day repeating pattern in which lunar and solar eclipses recur in predictable sequences. They didn't know why it worked. They had no model of orbital mechanics, no concept of the moon's shadow falling on the Earth. But they had hundreds of years of recorded eclipse observations, and through pure pattern recognition, they realized eclipses repeat on a schedule. And once you know the schedule, you can predict the next one. Now imagine what this means socially. You are a high priest. The population around you lives in total terror of eclipses. Everyone does, from the king down to the farmer in the field. And then you calmly walk up to the king 3 weeks before an eclipse and say, on this date, at midday, the sun will darken. Prepare the rituals. Prepare the substitute king. We already know it's coming. The king doesn't die of shock because you told him in advance. The population doesn't descend into panic chaos because the priests are already prepared, already performing the countermeasures. You guided them through the terror. And when the sun came back, because it always came back, you were the reason. In the minds of the population, you had managed the eclipse. You had negotiated with the cosmos on their behalf. This is how eclipse prediction became one of the most politically potent abilities a person could possess in the ancient world. Knowing about eclipses in advance was not just intellectually impressive, it was a source of direct political authority. Kings funded astronomical programs not out of curiosity, but because the ability to predict terrifying cosmic events was the ultimate demonstration of divine favor and institutional legitimacy. This pattern repeated across cultures. In ancient China, the royal astronomers were government officials. Missing an eclipse prediction, failing to warn the emperor in advance, was a capital offense. You could be executed for failing to predict the sky correctly. The stakes of astronomy were life and death in both directions. The eclipse itself could kill the king through bad omens, but failing to predict it could kill the astronomer through bureaucratic execution. That is how seriously these events were taken. There are accounts from Mesoamerica of Mayan astronomer priests who tracked Venus cycles and eclipse tables with staggering precision, carved into bark books called codices, and who used this knowledge to time warfare, religious ceremonies, and political transitions. The Dresden Codex, one of the few surviving Mayan books, contains eclipse prediction tables accurate enough that modern astronomers have verified them with retrograde calculations. These priests weren't guessing. They were calculating. And that calculation was pure, concentrated social power. So the next time someone tells you ancient people were just primitive and superstitious, remember that the same fear of eclipses that set people running in terror also drove some of the earliest systematic astronomical research in human history. Fear, it turns out, is a remarkably powerful motivator for doing science, even if you don't know you're doing science. Number 7. And now for something that even modern observers find genuinely eerie. When a total solar eclipse happens, human beings aren't the only ones who react. Animals react too. And their reactions are so consistent, so universal, so predictable, that ancient people noticed them and incorporated animal behavior into their eclipse mythology in ways that reveal just how deeply embedded this event is in the behavior of the natural world. Birds stop singing. They stop mid-song, mid-flight, mid-whatever they were doing, and they either go silent or return to their roosts. They think it's night. The cue that tells them it's nighttime, the angle and intensity of light, has arrived unexpectedly, and they respond to it. Crickets begin chirping. Frogs begin calling. Nocturnal insects emerge. Flowers close their petals. Bees return to their hives. The entire biological world, operating on the assumption that light means day and darkness means night, responds to a total solar eclipse exactly as if night had arrived, and then, 3 to 7 minutes later, responds again to the return of daylight, in a kind of confused ecological whiplash. In ancient times, this was terrifying for a different reason than the darkness itself. The animals knew something was wrong before the humans did. Or at least, they responded before humans had fully processed what was happening. When your cows walk into the barn at noon, when the birds you rely on for seasonal signals go silent in the middle of the morning, the message is clear. The natural order has broken. The machinery of the world is misfiring. Whatever God or force maintains the regular schedule has slipped. Certain ancient cultures wove this animal behavior directly into their cosmological explanations of eclipses. In some Native American traditions, the silence of birds during an eclipse was interpreted as the animals paying respect to a power greater than any they normally encountered. The silence was reverence, not fear. The animals understood something that humans could only sense but not articulate. That framing is beautiful, actually. It doesn't require the animals to be afraid. It makes them witnesses, participants in a cosmic ceremony rather than victims of confusion. In Hindu tradition, eclipses were associated with Rahu, a demon who periodically swallowed the sun or moon. During an eclipse, rituals required people to avoid eating, to bathe in sacred rivers, to refrain from normal activities. The logic was similar to animal behavior. Actually, if the normal rules of day and night no longer apply, the normal rules of human life should also be suspended. Sacred rivers, like the Ganges, would be filled with pilgrims during eclipse windows, because the disruption of cosmic order was seen as a moment when the boundary between the sacred and the ordinary became thinner than usual. A moment of access. A dangerous, precious, holy disruption. And here is the detail that makes this even more remarkable. Modern studies have confirmed that animals genuinely behave this way during total solar eclipses. Birds do return to roosts. Crickets do chirp. Bees do go home. Chimpanzees in research settings have been documented staring at the eclipse and climbing to the tops of structures, behavior associated with threat detection and environmental monitoring. The ancient observers were right. The animals did know. They were just wrong about what the animals knew and why. When your entire explanation of the world is built on the assumption that the sun operates by predictable divine rules, seeing the animals behave as if night has fallen at noon is absolute confirmation that something has gone catastrophically wrong. You don't need to understand the orbital mechanics. The birds told you everything. Number 6. And now we get to the part where eclipse fear didn't just terrify populations. It actually bent the course of recorded history. Multiple times. With consequences that lasted centuries. Let's talk about Christopher Columbus. In 1504, Columbus and his crew were stranded on the island of Jamaica. They had been there for months. Their ships were worm-eaten and sinking. The indigenous Arawak people had initially been generous, trading food for the trinkets the Spanish carried. But after months of increasingly one-sided exchanges and the crew's increasingly bad behavior, the Arawak decided to stop feeding them. Columbus and his men were facing starvation. And then Columbus consulted an almanac, a European astronomical almanac that he happened to have on board. And he saw that a total lunar eclipse was coming on February 29, 1504. He gathered the Arawak leaders and told them, in no uncertain terms, that God was angry with them for not supplying his men with food. And as proof of God's anger, in 3 days, he would cause the moon to rise blood red and disappear. 3 days later, the lunar eclipse happened exactly on schedule. The Arawak were terrified. Completely and genuinely terrified. They brought food. They begged Columbus to intercede with his God. Columbus disappeared into his cabin, presumably timing the eclipse with an hourglass, and emerged when the moon was almost fully restored to announce that God had been appeased. The food supplies resumed. Columbus's crew survived. And this manipulation of eclipse fear, through the simple act of owning an almanac, directly influenced the Spanish colonial project in the Caribbean. This is arguably the most cold-blooded use of eclipse fear in recorded history. But it was built on the same foundation as every other example in this video. The assumption, deep and culturally universal, that a disappearing celestial body is a communication from a higher power. Columbus didn't create that assumption. He just weaponized it. Now let's go even further back. To ancient Egypt, around 1223 BC. The pharaoh Merneptah was dealing with a coalition of Libyan tribes and sea peoples threatening the western delta. There is textual evidence suggesting that a solar eclipse occurred during or near the period of this conflict, and that it was interpreted by the Egyptian court as a divine omen of military victory. The pharaoh's priests declared that the darkness signaled the sun god Ra withdrawing his protection from the enemies of Egypt. Whatever the specific sequence of events, the Egyptian forces won a decisive victory. And the eclipse was written into the royal record as divine confirmation of Pharaoh's cosmic authority. In the ancient world, the ability to interpret an eclipse as being on your side was just as politically powerful as being able to predict one. The eclipse didn't care about sides, but the priests did. And that interpretive authority, the ability to declare what the cosmos meant, was a form of power that no army could defeat. It lived in the minds of entire populations. It shaped decisions about war, succession, sacrifice, and survival for thousands of years. The thing that genuinely haunts me about all of this is not the superstition. Superstition is easy to dismiss in retrospect. What's harder to dismiss is the human need that the superstition served. When something impossible happens, When the sun goes dark in the middle of the day, people need an explanation. They need the event to mean something. And every culture that ever watched an eclipse reached for meaning in the only vocabulary they had. The vocabulary of gods, dragons, demons, and cosmic hunger. We have better vocabulary now. We have orbital mechanics and shadow cones and the Saros cycle. But watch a total solar eclipse in person. Feel the temperature drop. Watch the stars appear at noon. Hear the world go silent. And you will understand, in your body rather than your mind, exactly why the ancients were afraid. The knowledge doesn't fully protect you. The animal response is still there. The universe still feels, in that moment, like it has broken a promise. And that is why the ancients feared eclipses. Not because they were primitive, not because they were foolish, but because they were paying attention, with everything they had, to a universe that hadn't yet given them the tools to understand what they were seeing. If you want more videos about the moments where history and the cosmos collided, subscribe, because we cover exactly that kind of thing around here. Leave a comment. Tell me which ancient culture's response surprised you the most. I read every single one.